joint workshop with our Long Range Finance Committee. First off, if we could just start with some introductions. We have some new faces around the table. If we could start with Adam, that would be great, and work our way around.
Excellent. Hi, everybody. I'm Adam Belcarelli with the Long Range Finance Committee.
I'm John Zerbano, also with the Long Range Finance Committee.
Todd Hutchison with the Long Range Finance Committee.
Aaron Wojciechowski, City Council member.
I'm Russ Van Gompel, the Finance Director. Introduce yourself.
I'm Crystal Wagner, the Management Analyst.
I'm John Fitzpatrick, the Assistant City Manager.
Matt Mugrower, City Council member.
Mark Roloff, City Manager.
Karen Bowen, Long Range Finance Committee.
Lindsay Erickson, Council Member.
Lori Palmieri, Mayor.
Courtney Hansen, City
Here, I'll share. Okay, Director of Finance, Mr. Van Gompel, please.
Well, thank you, Madam Mayor. So you received a digital copy of what I'm presenting with one minor update, and I'll highlight that. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'd like to walk through. If you're okay, my thought would be to hand out copies of the PowerPoint presentation afterwards, so that you can kind of focus. We can focus our discussion on the slides as we go through, and take it from there. Before I get started, I know that I had some comments on the way up. This is not just Russ's project. This is a team project. It starts with the city manager. It starts with the department heads, but most importantly, without my department in finance, we couldn't make this happen without everybody working together. And I want to acknowledge all the effort that my entire finance team worked on it. Crystal Wagner is our management analyst, and this is her first go around on our CIP. She's going to help us out on the CIP and operating budget. That's her primary focus. We had some little bit of learning curve, and we had some things, as I mentioned earlier, about getting the tabs within the binder. So hopefully you can bear with me, but you won't need the binder or the electronic version to begin with, but I might refer you to it as we go along. Oh, there, come on. So there's a cover memo, within the binder saying that, and just I want to kind of review the cover memo real quickly. Long Range Finance looked at the capital improvement plan or policy in 2022. They recommended some changes. Those changes were adopted by the City Council, and after that, City Council directed staff to also include how we can include everybody, diversity, inclusion, and equity within our planning process. So we have added on our scoring sheet underserved population that's being served. So that's new to our plan. Tonight I want to focus on the plan itself, and I want to talk about some policies as we get into it, specifically relating to ARPA and debt. And I think that's why Long Range Finance and City Council wanted to meet together so we can talk about our framework of debt issuance moving forward. So we really want to try to focus on the plan tonight. If you do have some questions on projects, I can do some brief overview, but the department heads are not here this evening to answer specific questions. We kind of have done that with our operating budget process when we start talking about the different departments. So for the first time, we are now expanding our capital improvement planning process to 10 years. Previously, it was 5 years, and last year we went 10 years for public works projects, and that helps us focus in on getting grants from other agencies. But now we're starting to look at a 10-year window. We started talking about a 10-year window for facilities, but we're also looking at a 10-year window for other things, so we can kind of look at our funding source and how do we make this as a smooth transition. How do we plan for projects? Because we have a great need for many projects that have to be addressed. And I think some of that, I don't think we can get done in 5 years. So within your binder and your electronic packet, we have a funding summary. I'm going to talk about funding summary in just a little bit. It's actually a summary page, just a one-page summary. And then we have a listing of all the projects by funding source. So if you wanted to see how many projects are being funded out of a particular funding source, you can go to that page. We also have a department summary that looks at all of the expenditures or projects by department. And new this year, where there's actually a project that has report of projects and funding by department. So if you were to look at infrastructure, public infrastructure, you can see all the projects and then you can see all the funding all in kind of one picture area. And then the last thing I want to talk about, and when we get into funding sources, is our ARPA allocation. The City Council approved projects in 2022 and actually appropriated some money. I have a list of recommended projects for you to consider as part of the budget process for 2023 and 2024. And we can talk about that as we go along. Again, the 10-year process is being expanded. Some departments are still kind of working on making this transition from 5 to 10. So there's a couple departments that still have a lot of their projects focused on the first 5 years, but we're trying to get it out for 10. Just to kind of review that the plan that you have before you right now has identified 14 million plus in projects for 2023. Council will remember, and maybe Long Range Finance might recall this, but we actually borrowed in 2022 $7,300,500 for 2023 projects. So as presented right now, the request for your consideration would be new debt of 6.9, just under $7 million. And that's going to be important when we start looking at our debt numbers. So as it stands right now, we already borrowed 7.3, and we're looking just under 7 as a potential new debt issuance for 2023. So that totals $14 million. Does that make sense for everybody? Then the city manager and myself also looked at projects for 2024. Right now, we are looking at a placeholder of $18 million in the years 2025 to 2032. I'll show that spreadsheet and what that does with our ratio of our debt to our legal debt limit, and we can talk about that. But right now we have a placeholder of $18 million for those years, and in 2024 we have projects for your consideration at 18.2, almost $18.3 million. One of the other things I heard about as far as our percentage of state legal debt limit was to try to get that down. I think Long Range Finance talked about that. There were some members that were kind of looking at our goal right now is to get down to 50, and we'll talk about where our percentage is now. But if we have 2.69, which is the average of the last 5 years, and again, there were some years prior to that we didn't have this type of growth, we had equalized value growth of about 2.69%. If that continues for the next 10 years, we'll be at 42% of our legal debt limit by the year 2032. And I know that some members are looking at that as a potential measurement. The last thing I want to talk about then are monies that we actually levy in our operating budget. I'll identify the projects that are included in that levy number and talk about that. So the big policy issues to think about now, and as we have discussion this evening, is what projects would we want to consider to be funded with the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, and what's our framework for future debt issuance. So that's kind of the framework for you this evening. For the projects in 2023, we really have two major facility buildings that are included in the recommendation for you to consider of $2.7 million, and that's two new buildings. Those would be buildings that would help replace the storage facility at Sawyer. One of the long-range projects that we talked about on the facilities needs is an emergency operations center and a training facility at the old Armory site on Sawyer Street. To do that, we're looking and recommending a new storage facility for the police department on 3rd Avenue.
Yes.
And then another $1 million storage facility for elections, museum and other things on a site to be determined. So that's in the works right now. Infrastructure, the kind of the key main projects are West Lincoln, Wisconsin, Tyler, Arthur, and Bradley, and those dollar amounts. If you get outside of the general obligation debt, we're looking at water revenue bonds of about $9.7 million. Inside the plan, and the council still is working through the whole issue with the clear wells, but it also includes funding through the Safe Drinking Loan Program for the ozone upgrades at the water filtration plant. So there's a total of $16.9 million identified in here for Safe Drinking Loan Program. We have sanitary sewer revenue debt of 5.5 and stormwater revenue debt at 14.7. So those are outside of the general obligation numbers. But big picture, that's pretty much what we're looking at for 2023. Just want to spend a minute. We talk about our CIP funding sources. We've got special assessments, utility debt. We have utility funds, basically user fees and fund balance. General obligation debt, I want to talk a lot about that tonight, where we go, what's our framework. We also will sometimes issue state trust fund loans for private purposes. I talked about the Save Drinking Water Loan Program, talked about the levy. We do have some TID cash and some projected TID cash for some projects. ARPA is another one that I want to talk about a little bit more tonight. We have some cash fund balance. We have trade-in, grants, donations, transit, and there's another funding category in here. And there are some projects that, quite honestly, the city manager and myself do not have a funding source, and the funding source is to be determined. We could not identify an appropriate funding source to include within the frameworks that we wanted to present to you tonight. So we can talk about those projects, but quite honestly, those projects that are in the category to be determined probably aren't going to happen in 2023. To be honest with you, and where we're at in the process. But we're certainly open to discuss any of that. If you wanted to look at your book and just look real quickly, there's a tab that says funding source summary, probably about 6 tabs in. It's a one-page summary of all of our projects, and it's just a total by all these funding categories that I just told you about. So if you're following along, you may want to look at that. And we can talk about the specific funding sources and projects by funding sources a little bit later. What I wanted to do a little bit, and it's included in your memo, was just a review of ARPA funding. So we'll have the 4 major revenue categories I wanted to talk about this evening. And after I go through this, we'll probably open it up for some questions. But the city received $20.5 million in ARPA. The city council last year adopted a resolution stating their intent to keep 75% of ARPA funds for city infrastructure projects. In 2022, the city council appropriated $4 million for projects. That left a balance of 11.3. I have projects identified in 2023 at 3 million plus, in 2024 6.5, and that would leave a balance of 1.7. The actual ARPA projects are right behind the memo. Those were updated since the electronic version went out. So the first page is the projects that were funded or appropriated in 2022 that totaled to $4 million, and that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. And then the second page in the light yellow, light orange is just north of $3 million for potential projects, and those are listed and itemized, and then the 2024 projects are also identified.
And just a clarification, this does not include, Russ is only spending on this sheet the 75% dedicated to infrastructure. The 25% dedicated to non-infrastructure is sort of, that's my project. The 75% is Russ's project. So, and that's what you'll be seeing later in the next, within the next few meetings.
I don't know if we want to spend any quick moment on any comments or thoughts on the projects listed in 2023 or 2024.
We have until 2020 or through 2024 to spend.
Yeah,
our
we
money?
have to be
Commit.
Commit. Okay.
So we don't have to spend it, but we have to commit to it. So let's just say there's a project in 2024, and I'm just trying to throw out one, the Quinn truck. If there's a delay, it doesn't arrive until 2025, we're good.
Does anybody have any questions or comments about what's on that list, what I had put on that list for your consideration?
For the most part, these are items that have been on the CIP, but just continue to get pushed back because lack of funding sources over the years. And
majority-
just deferred maintenance, deferred needs.
The majority are, there are some things that have kind of risen to the surface that have been added to the list. But I don't think there's anything, earth shattering other than, we struggle to look at the other major funding sources, debt, levy, and, trying to keep the levy amount fairly reasonable and the debt amount fairly reasonable. And I thought these would be appropriate projects. Some of them followed what we actually did in 2022, just, some additional versions of that. But I don't think there's anything really outstanding on that list.
Yeah, you'll notice on the second page, for example, the museum loading doors. Museum Director Phillips and Mr. Van Goppel and I have talked about the reprioritizing of museum projects. The loading doors were in the CIP, but they've been moved up because other museum CIPs have been moved back. And that's just a fresh set of eyes taking a look at it and coming up with what I believe is a better approach, and that's why it's moved up, and that's why it's highlighted, because we shuffled a couple things around.
And that actually was one of the changes since the electronic version went out last week. All right, I'm going to continue if there's no other discussions on ARPA projects, because I want to try to cover some of these. So I have to apologize, but I wanted just to focus now on debt. And some of this, I'm sure, is not new, but I wanted to just refresh everybody's memory. General obligation debt is tax exempt. Bonds go out 20 years, notes go out 10. The state trust fund is taxable. Has been used in the past, but it's used for private purpose mostly, for economic development. And we can do that and set our own terms. In addition to general obligation debt, as I mentioned before, we have water utility revenue bonds, sanitary sewer revenue bonds, and stormwater revenue bonds. But I just wanted to do a quick overview on that. General obligation debt is backed by the full faith and credit of the city. The council that is seated today makes a irrevocable pledge to levy taxes into the future to pay that debt. It's some of the most reliable debt. In the normal market conditions, the interest rate is lower, and that did not happen this year. Some of our revenue debt, because of timing and stuff, actually was a little bit lower interest rate, and it's basically can be used for funding source for basically all kinds of debt. Some of our strategies, we've been as aggressive as possible in street and stormwater programs. We have shifted some of our general obligation debt to revenue bonds. Now, the city manager, myself, actually had a presentation or sat in on a presentation that was made by the Whitburn Center at UW Oshkosh to the Chamber of Commerce. And the Chamber of Commerce was noting our reliance more on utility debt, and was looking at that as maybe another thing, but we have shifted that to revenue debt so that the users, the ratepayers that pay and use utilities, pay for the debt, not taxpayers. And while it may be somewhat similar, but it's not. I mean, it's really based, and it gets calculated on the utility rates. So it's based on how much consumption on the utility side people pay for, because a portion of that goes toward debt repayment versus general obligation debt is paid for by a tax levy. We've had some high-profile economic development projects that had a little bit longer payback period. Here's a couple examples. These have been on the screen before. We use general obligation debt when we have grants that are coming in and it's matching funds. We try to look at our equipment and keep our equipment to notes because that seems to be a little bit shorter. And actually, on the sanitation, the sanitation trucks have a 3-year life, and we actually amortize those over 3 years instead of 10 years. But we try to match up the life of the debt. The city did have a window where they had to borrow to carry the cost of special assessments when we were quite heavily in the special assessment program. We need special assessments to pay for a portion of our utility projects, but we need to pay the contractor. So we used to borrow money and have the assessments come in and repay it. Now our repayment schedule, because of people paying off their assessments and those type of things, we have enough in reserves to pay off the special assessments. The fund itself can carry that cash flow while we wait for collections on other special assessments. This assumes no changes in the special assessment program. I know that council and probably long-range finance may chime in on other fees. We've talked about a transportation utility fee or a fee to replace special assessments. None of that is included in this capital project plan, just so you're aware where we're at, because that policy is still being formulated and kind of digested by council and hasn't given us any firm direction at this point. Go ahead, Mayor.
No, I was just going to ask if there will be an opportunity for us to look at what that policy might do to this before we pass.
Absolutely. I think that you need to ask that question. We need to look at that.
I guess it doesn't have much of an impact though on the CIP. Either way, the projects are moving forward and they're being paid
It's
for.
just one.
It's just how are they being
How are you going to pay for it?
But the projects themselves are moving forward at full speed.
But it may be mistaken. I thought there might have been mention that we might be looking at something with sidewalk and.
That's a portion
That's
of
only
it.
been a conceptual thing that hasn't
Right,
really,
right.
that hasn't formally come to
And
council.
if we do that, I think you should be asking those questions, and we will be presenting that information to you. But that will have an impact. But for this evening, we're assuming status quo. Okay, this is the point of discussion at the last long-range finance, and I think we've had a couple meetings at long-range finance about how this picture might look moving forward. Through our strategic planning process, we looked at our needs for facilities, and I worked with the administrative services and the facility folks, and we've come up with a plan. And that plan basically looks at, for the next 10 years, about $6.5 million to cover various building needs within our city organization. We have that list. So if that's 6.5, and just kind of, this is a broad framework right now for discussion. And you'll see that some of the requests from some of these areas are higher than this. But for a point of starting the discussion, I looked at providing parks with about $750,000 a year for parks projects. Now, if you go to the parks project page, and if we get to that section, you'll see the need is higher than that. And we tried to trim that back. Right now, this includes $500,000 for sidewalk improvements each year that are going to be paid for by debt. How that debt gets repaid is another point that we'll have to discuss. Planning and economic development, a placeholder of $500,000, but again, we got requests of $1, $2, and $3 million projects coming up in planning and economic development when you start looking at the remainder of the Riverwalk system and other things that they would like to do. So that might be a little light. streets, we're trying to earmark, the $5 to $7.5 million a year. And right now, if you look at the street projects, they're a little bit less than that 7.5. They're like the $5 to $6 million range. So that gives us a little bit of flexibility. And equipment's been running about $2.5 million a year for just public works, parks, and all the other operational equipment needs of our organization. Comes up to $18,250. I'm working on a framework that you might want to ask you to consider $18 million a year for debt. I know we've done $14 million, we've done $15 million, we did more last year, but I'm trying to provide a stable framework in looking into the future. This is one possible way of incorporating that. City manager thinks I might be a little light, but I'm trying to be fairly reasonable when we start looking at what this means for our debt and for our ratio of debt to the state limit.
I think Russ gave many caveats to every category there, and that's why I think it's a little light. But I think he also recognizes that the council has a certain tolerance that they're gonna, at a certain point, you're gonna say ouch to whatever that, and each of you will have a different ouch threshold, but you're all gonna see a number and say, I can't accept that. So the number 18 and 2 is just simply taking these, basic categories and adding them up. This facilities of $6.5 million is an identification through our facility analysis. 10 years, we got $65 million worth of projects. 65 divided by 10. It's that simple. So, it is going to change. In 1 year, it's going to be lower. For example, 2023, Russ only has 2.7. The year we do City Hall, good example.
18. Right now, it's a placeholder.
Yeah, it's a placeholder, and it's a big placeholder because it's as big as a single number for a year. So that's what we're facing. But I think it's a matter of how do you make it manageable? You just start talking about it. That's how we start. Where we go from there is going to end up on your individual tolerance levels that you tell us.
To kind of just put this in historical or future perspective, I would direct you to, there's a summary page by department, about 10 tabs in or something like projects by
Is it department summary?
funding,
Summary.
source, and, summary, that's it. That's what I was looking for. And if you were to look at about halfway down the page, our source of funding in 4401 is just our own internal code. So this is the funding source summary page. And you'll see debt of 14.2 in 2023. And again, some of that's already been funded.
So you mean funding source and department then, Russ?
No, just it's just funding source summary. That's what I meant.
Oh, funding source summary, I'm sorry.
I misspoke. That's what I wanted to direct your attention to. It should have operations, cash fund balance, TID cash, trade-in, levy. But go all the way down to line item 4401 is debt. And you'll see 14.2 in 2023, 18.2 in 2024. And we've trimmed projects and pushed projects back. But we know there's a lot of work to do because if you look at 2025, that number's 31 million. 2026, it's 36 million. 2027 is 20 million. 2028 is 19 million. 29, 21 million, and then we get back down to some other numbers. But you see, we really focused on identifying projects for the next 2 years as a framework for this plan, knowing quite well that there will have to be adjustments, prioritizations, and thoughts about timing when we get to the projects identified in 25, 20, 26, 20, 27, and so on. Everybody follow me okay on that?
What page was that again?
It's called the funding summary tab.
I'm in that tab.
But you look to line 4401 about halfway down. Oh, no, you're not at the
Way
right page.
back when
Adam
we
Mayer.
first started.
There's only one page.
There's just one page.
It's
only the first
probably about 7 tabs in.
Funding source.
Okay.
I know, yeah. So line 4401 again is debt. I'd like to talk a little bit later, I'll talk about levy. I didn't really want to talk about levy right now, but I just wanted to point that out. And there's a line for ARPA projects, and that's 4208. And then 9,000 is those projects to be determined. But right now we're talking about debt, so that's what I wanted to kind of keep our focus on right now for this moment. Okay? So this spreadsheet, and I can call up the live version and we can work with this. But this is what I mentioned earlier where in 2023, the green box, hopefully you can read those numbers. I'm really sorry. This turns out you can't read it. Should I try to make it bigger? Oh, I don't know.
I know if I can't read it from here, people definitely can't read it from home.
Okay. Why don't you just hold tight for a minute? I will go to the exact Excel spreadsheet in just a minute. I'll just let's just do this. We can do it this way.
Is that in the printed version too? Right?
Yeah. Let's go here. How about this? I can make this. And let's slide this back over. So 2023, $7.5 million. And our ratio, if we borrow 7.5 new money in 2023 would be at 49.97. This year we're at 54 because we borrowed $30 million because council wanted to do some of the 2023 projects before, with the thought being market conditions and rates are going up. So that's why we went from debt taken on, this column over here. We added in the past, and some of this is refinancing. So we've added like 11, 21, 18, 14, and then 30 million in 2022. That's the general obligation debt taken on. If I go down, for the next 10 years, then the yellow, I left it at 18, and that's where I come up with the 42.28%. You can see those numbers okay?
Yes, thank you.
So I just wanted to go through the point being that there's 3 matrices that long-range finance says we should look at. One of them is our percentage of debt to the legal debt limit. Legal debt limit is 5% of our equalized value. So as our equalized value, and these are all projected equalized value numbers, with an increase of 2.69%, if that continues to occur and we do this type of debt issuance, that's the percentage of debt we'll have to the debt limit by the state of Wisconsin.
But if we don't continue to achieve that 2 point,
that percentage changes. And you can make that percentage, I can make it 0 right now if you want.
And that's why I like the spreadsheet. I know everybody likes because
a toy.
What if everybody gets to put in, if you're a pessimist or an optimist, it doesn't matter, we can show that. But 2.69, if you had asked me that 5 years ago, I would have said you're crazy. But now we've had 8% increase. So what's the right number?
So if we had no growth in equalized value for the next 10 years, instead of 42%, that'd be 56%. Now, we don't know what this year's number is going to be. I will know that when we start talking about the budget. It'll probably be August, September-ish when we'll get that equalized value number, or at least an estimate. So right now, I just have to work off the projected number.
So if we're supposed to decide on this, wouldn't it make more sense that we make that decision after we know that information?
Well, I'm trying, again, one of the policy decisions that I was hoping to come out of tonight is that framework. And if that framework and these assumptions hold true, I'm trying to say it looks pretty good from a financial perspective. You have to make that decision every year, and if something goes haywire, we don't get that growth, then we don't do the $18 million of new money, new debt. But as a framework going forward, or a policy, I'm telling you, I think it's workable in a financial, reasonable, and responsible manner.
But it's about setting some goals, right? We had some goals previous. We've achieved some of them. We've got to set some new ones, I think, personally. I think and there's several council members that agree that we need to set some new goals, something to work towards.
That in 2014, that was 61%.
And so
It was
getting
actually
down-
70 at one point.
It was 72-ish.
And we said we wanted to get it to 50. That was the goal that the long range finance and the city council talked about. And we kind of are there, except for this outlier year where we pre-borrowed for 2023 projects.
You set the number to 0. What would happen and just if you set it to -1? Can you do that? And I want to see the percentage.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, we could, you could have
I
lots
just-
of fun. This is the mayor smiled at a spreadsheet. That just gives you an idea. But this is important because the what ifs, I would say for most of the past decade, it was darn near 0. And so, but there were some negative years, so it's a valid question. But as Russ said, every year, that's why we revisit this every single year. Because it's sort of like looking at a GPS and it says your arrival time's 2:00 and all of a sudden your arrival time's 2:30.
Right.
Something's happened on the road ahead of you. But then all of a sudden it goes back. Things have improved. That's literally what we're doing. We're looking at our future radar and it's telling us what we think and where we think we're going to be.
So yeah, then it goes all the way up to 63% in
Okay,
2032.
so we're still legal.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, legal's not, but the issue is what's acceptable, because the other shift is, let's say you get negative growth, do you reduce the borrowing? And then you say, okay, do you go back to 15?
Yeah.
And then if you go back to 15, then you got to go back to that sheet that says, is $6.5 million in facility borrowing? Is that realistic? The answer is no. I mean, there's a former school board member. It's like, at a certain point you got to say, well, we can't do those. And then you dial it back. And then things improve, maybe you dial it up. You just got to keep making that swaying motion.
And just to add to what Mark said, I think to that point, that has played a part also in the facilities condition that we're in right now because of the last 10 years and our actual growth. So it's part of the process.
All right. So we can go back to that if you'd like. Oops, I didn't want to start from the beginning. I wanted to start where I was. So, the question was before, from 2014, and we can actually go back further. But for this, I'm looking forward. What happens with our ratio, and again, this line here is 50%. And you can see, basically because of the growth in the equalized value, that percentage is going lower. What's really nice is the red line is the actual state imposed debt limit. And the blue line is our projected year-end debt, which is the measurement that we have to go by. So this is good that gap's widening. We want that. It gives us more flexibility, more movement. So if things got stable and you still wanted to do projects in 2025 and 2026, you have some flexibility. So that's an important thing to consider. So that's important point.
And go back to that for a second, just to reemphasize a point that.
Did I go too far? Yeah.
Yeah, that blip in 22 is the extra borrowing for 23, but you take you start at the beginning and go to the end point, and it's a very slow, gradual change, which means we're holding our own on our outstanding debt, but because the red line goes up, that's our percentage is gonna keep going down, make slow, steady progress.
Basically, we're taking on new debt as we're taking off old debt. I mean,
Yeah.
for a while, we were taking off debt, we were issuing debt less than what we were retiring debt at, but we're about level right now.
And for the last 6 or so years, we have paid off more than we've borrowed, which has been the one big contributing factor. Then once the equalized value started to kick in, because it did, for a whole decade, it was pretty stagnant, as you were suggesting. You put those two together where you're paying off more debt than you're taking on and you get equalized value. That's how we got so quickly from 60 to 50% on our limit, because both parts of the ratio were working in our favor. But our fortunes can change.
Is this metric something that we compare against other communities and similar?
Yeah. I think after the last long-range finance, I sent you out some comparison data. And I can certainly revisit that if you'd like, but yeah, I think,
We don't have it in here, right?
I did not put it in here, I'm so sorry. But when UW Oshkosh Whitburn Center made their presentation to the chamber, I think they had some of that in there as well, of how we compare to other communities. Quite honestly, in Oshkosh, we're always comparing ourselves to Appleton, and Appleton has a much lower percent of the state legal debt limit. They're like in the 20s. But if you look at Fond du Lac, Eau Claire,
Beloit,
a couple other ones, we're right on par.
Janesville, we're all in that 50% range, so that's good.
The last numbers I had was 2019. I don't have 2020 numbers. Again, that'll come out later this summer, early fall.
One of the measures that Moody's Investor Service looks at is the per capita property value per capita. And Appleton has a higher level of value per capita than we do. We're actually a little better than Janesville and Beloit. So our percentage is a little better, but not much. It's a little better. And it's sort of reflective of that property value per capita.
Any other discussions on debt, on the framework that this plan is relying on, the 18 million bucks? What is that appetite seem to be about right? With the parameters that we've explained so far, getting to the 40%, I'm going to look at Matt, because he was the one that was kind of suggesting the 40% number and working with what I thought we could take on and get to that in a foreseeable future. With a reasonable growth and equalized value. That's what I thought would be an appropriate suggested starting point.
I do have a question on that framework. So, with streets being the most significant in that framework, does this encompass doing more miles per year?
Quite honestly, no, because again, the cost per mile is changing. But when we start talking about the review of the department expenditure side, I'll show you the account as utility infrastructure. If you can just hold that question, Mayor. I'll present to you what James has put. There's how much they can handle internally as far as staff time to bid out projects and administer construction projects. And he's got a framework that he presented to us, and we didn't really adjust that, which is in that $5 to $6 to $7 million range. And I'll point out that number when we get to it. Right. But that's about his capacity, as I understand it, his capacity for projects that they can work and bid out and design and administer on a construction side.
It's been between 33 and 40% of our total borrowing generally, because that's obviously, the biggest part of any capital improvement program. And that's just on the general fund side. So that gives you a rough idea. And if you do the math, if you got your calculator, it's probably about 38% if I'm doing my math right.
And then on the equipment side, you mentioned, I think, like vehicles, public works, operational type vehicles. Would this have any inclusion, since we're looking at 10 years, in moving towards the electric
We've had, let me just go back and talk about the process a little bit, because I didn't cover that in the beginning. We ask all departments to submit requests, and to be quite honest with you, almost every single department, we talked about equipment. We talked about, what's the future holding, and how are we planning for any type of alternative fuel or alternative sourced equipment, including electric vehicles. Some of that is on the cutting edge right now, and some of it, I think we can make a really easy transition with maybe some of the more service type vehicles or common vehicle types like pickup trucks and cars and those type of things. Some of the heavy equipment stuff, there's still some concerns with output and towing capacity. So they're all the departments that we talked to. City manager can chime in on this, but they are aware of our desire to, stay abreast with the market, look at alternative sources of fuel. And city manager always comments on his CNG experience. But electric is there. We all know it. And just what type of vehicles can we convert to that, and where do we go from here?
And the reason I ask is because obviously, once we move over to the operational side, I'm anticipating we're going to see some hugely excessive fuel dollar amounts based on
Yep.
challenges.
That was the experience we had when we did CNG and started that experiment. I think the difference now is that the car companies are investing in it, so I think it's for real. There was a little bit of speculation, I think, with CNG, and obviously it didn't pan out. But part of it started with conversation I had with Oshkosh Corporation, because the number of CNG garbage trucks they were doing 12 years ago was a good half of their fleet. So I was like, if they're willing to do it, I think we should look at it. And that's when we seriously started looking at it. Still didn't work out, but one of the advantages of investing in garbage trucks is garbage trucks have a short shelf life because of how much wear and tear they take. So it was easy to take that chance. Fortunately, we didn't invest in the infrastructure of fueling, which we had a discussion about, ultimately decided not to do it. Thank goodness we didn't. Quick Trip did, and they still got the stations, and I think we're their biggest customer for CNG. For CNG. But I see the electric is something, and I've challenged the departments, like, look at it from each individual type of vehicle use. Some are going to make sense and others aren't yet. I know there's always examples, but some of the examples there's still more to it than just, can you save on fuel? It's, can you get reliable electricity? Do we have the infrastructure to do it?
Do we have the people to service and all of that?
Yeah, the training. And we had to do a little bit of training in CNG, but honestly, it wasn't a lot. So in that case, it was an easy risk to take. But with electric, it's like, if you talk to our garage superintendent, Travis, he'll tell you, I would have to send a few more people back to school to make sure we do that. But we're keeping our finger on that pulse.
Okay.
Just one other clarification on facilities. So when we are using this broad category of facilities, we're talking about structures.
Mostly buildings
Okay.
and structures. I had a list, I think even Councilmember Mugarover has it. It's things that upgrade the library, the fire departments, police safety building, city hall, museum. It's more HVAC, more envelope type stuff. Anything else on this $18 million framework? That kind of covers a lot on the debt. I wanted to spend a little bit of time on the levy side. So if you're still at that funding source, summary page in that tab. If you go to line 4100, it's only about the 5th or 6th line down, is levy. The request is 1.2 in 2023, which is more than the 1.1 that we had in the levy for 2022. So I'm not sure, think that's doable. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to pull that off. We may have to make some modifications to that if we can't afford that on the levy side of things. If you look at future years, you'll see that in 2024, it's 1.3. Again, a lot of work in 25 and 26, 27, actually all the way out. So we've been kind of living in that 1 to 1.1 range, but we're stretching it. So we might have to kind of look at postponing it. For 23, some of the major categories, we got some IT improvements, basically upgrades on Microsoft and those type of things, about $170,000. We have facility maintenance and just the standard HVAC repair and parking lot repairs and all that other stuff, about $184,000. Again, this is levy numbers. Police and fire equipment at $136,000. Planning's got, a blight removal, some other things in there to the tune of about $500,000. Traffic and lighting $90,000, and then infrastructure $62,000. But this is just a broad-based overview of that category.
And typically, it's things that are not appropriate to borrow for. That's why we
Basically maintenance stuff, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the levy. Department, I don't want to go through all these categories, but we set up our CIP to talk about all the various departments. And we have a department summary tab that's about another 2 more tabs after the funding summary. It's actually 2 pages, and it has all of the departments listed from city clerk down to parkland improvements. And so all this is a total page by the different departments. And if you wanted to look out into the future, you can see once what that looks like.
Question on that. So like, on this summary, 6610, that should match up, shouldn't that figure match up to the parkland improvement tab, for example?
Please tell me it does.
Maybe I'm just looking at it strangely, but.
Let's see, hold on just a quick second.
It's for 2023.
No, it's $2,135,000, and it's both on the summary and then on the tab.
So 6610 is 550 on page 1 of that.
Hold on.
Which tab are you on, Madam Mayor?
This is on the projects by funding source and departments.
Okay, let's see one.
So it's summarized by,
So the total is $2,135,000. The summary page is only picking up the total, and then the funding sources are cash of $550, ARPA $470, debt $565, trust proceeds $425, and to be determined $125. Is that what you're looking at? I'm sorry.
Under the projects by funding source and department, page 1. And it's showing under 6610, 200,000 and 350,000 for a total of 550,000. Am I getting this wrong?
you're looking at it by funding source, and then it's broken out by department. So let's say a project is funded by multiple funding sources. You're
Okay.
you're going to see it listed in 2 different areas.
Okay. Gotcha.
Department summary, it's the same.
Yes, okay, I got it.
If you like function, the department summary is the best. If you're more of a
The color of money.
financial geek, you probably want the funding source one. And then the big one is feel like a little bit of both.
All right.
How's that for oversimplification? Todd's smiling. A good example is, in fact, we talked about this at staff meeting this morning. And it's that one I mentioned to you just before the meeting, Mayor, those barricades.
Yes.
You're going to see that barricade listed in 2 areas because it's something that the police are asking for, these barricades. And actually, the city of Waukesha is getting these, and we've been taking a very close look at what Waukesha's been doing in light of their tragedy last Christmas. And these barricades, I've had discussions with the Convention and Visitors Bureau for their capital development fund, because that is part of special events and things like that. So we've identified one funding source internally and a funding source externally. So you'll see that project listed twice in that summary by funding source and department, because it'll be funding source, I believe ARPA, and I just happened to, because Russ mentioned it this morning, and then funding source, grants, donations.
Yeah, so the
It'll be
most
there.
inclusive look is the tab that says projects and funding source by department. If you go to that tab, projects and funding source,
Next tab. Gotcha.
yes, go to that tab.
Okay.
And let me just walk you through that real quick so it's easy to understand. So the city clerk's requesting $132,000 for what's called Badger Books, which is a voter registration system, but it only has one funding source, ARPA. But if you look at IT, we have 4 projects listed, but 2 funding sources.
Yes.
So you can see what's being requested by the IT department and where it's being funded when you look at that page.
All right. I'm going to mark that one as the one I want to look at.
There you go.
Probably your favorite.
You know, actually, we probably could get by with just doing that one, but this is the first time I've printed this particular report because I kind of liked it, because it had a really good summary of projects and funding source. In the past, I didn't see this report, so I was giving you a summary of funding source and a summary of expenditures, but this really puts it all together. So I don't know, if you want to go through projects, I just want, right now, let me finish my overview real quick. You know, we took these project requests from the departments. We used all these factors in prioritizing, you know, whether it's, you know, it has imminent failure or critical need of replacement, contractual obligations, long-term commitments, maintaining grant eligibility, adherence to replacement schedules, public health, safety, security, long-term needs, items that are ending their useful life. We want to adhere to a replacement schedule and kind of spread this out so we don't have large log jams. We want to be proactive and try to avoid future increases if we can be a little bit proactive. We want to have our continued investment in culture, recreation, and education facilities. Neighborhood development is important. We want to try to avoid any increase in maintenance costs. We want to, again, keep to our recommended replacement schedules, and most importantly, meeting the goals of our city strategic plan. So that's all that went into it. And then we went to the scoring sheet, and this is the criteria in the scoring sheet as it conformed to the strategic plan. Are we leveraging outside funding, mandates, public health and safety, implementation feasibility, how well we can get projects done, what's the impact on the the operating budget, this new bullet point on population or underserved population, the project or item life, the frequency, service level, linkage to other programs or projects, infrastructure, investment or protection, encouraging economic development. So that is what all went into trying to prioritize all of these. If you want, we can spend some time on this, but my last slide for you tonight, and I did get this corrected on the PowerPoint and not on the memo. After the workshop tonight, the Plan Commission just again looks at the plan in whole. We asked City Council to take a separate action on this CIP. We're asking for that to occur in August. We do the final review As part of the budget process, we have another workshop, if necessary, scheduled for November 2nd. And the memo had an incorrect date, but we would look for approval of the 2023 projects with adoption of the operating budget on November 9th, which is a Wednesday in
Question on
2022.
that date. So the November 9th date, how do we choose that? Is there thing that November 9th date
Yep.
is impacted by, or
Definitely.
impacts, I should say?
Well, it all gets back to the famous thing that we send out at Christmas time to all
Yes.
our taxpayers. We have to get a levy certified, and we have to get that levy spread out and tax bills created. And our past practice has been the first meeting in November to adopt the budget and establish the tax levy. Because it takes about that amount of time to get Jennifer's quietly in the back of the room. And her main task is, once we get this adopted, is to actually get the levy certified and then tax bills printed and created and get ready for sending, which is a lot of work on our staff.
And it's also getting the tax bill or tax levies from the other agencies and
Right.
compiling all of that and putting it together and getting it out so that usually our goal is like the end of the first week of December. So we need about that whole month, pretty much a whole month, 4 weeks to
And
get it
it's
done.
a silly thing that Wisconsin likes to do called deer hunting, and there's also
Well, there
Thanksgiving.
happens to be an election on November 8th too.
Yeah,
That's why
that's why it's Wednesday the 9th.
That's why the meeting's
So it's
Wednesdays
a little
the 9th.
tied up that
Just
week.
a little bit, yeah. So, yeah, Jesse pointed that out this morning. So it's like, sorry, it's election day on the 8th, so we're not doing it that day.
So that's the last slide I have. Now, I don't know how much time you want to spend talking about any projects in particular. I can do a brief overview. And like I said, in the past, we've kind of focused on the 2023 projects when we did the department request. At this point, this is a plan. I reviewed the funding sources, talked to you about what I thought some of the discussion points should be, whether you're not comfortable or not on the ARPA recommendation, the financing plan for certain financing sources, debt, levy. I didn't really talk about the projects that don't have funding. We can certainly talk about that if you want, but at this point, there's no recommended funding source for those 5 or 6 projects.
But the general strategy is kind of where we're looking for some guidance on, because if we're not on the right track, we need to know sooner rather than later. Is the debt approach something that is acceptable to you? Is it too heavy? Is it not prioritized in the right areas? Do you want to rethink that based on if 18 million is too high? Do we have a revisit of our facilities? It's sort of colliding all of these different goals that council set, and it's like, okay, now what do you think? And it's like, wow, there's a lot to think about. The other part of that is ARPA. We've taken some liberties with things that we think are appropriate, and we've used the guidance from that council resolution that said they should be in the CIP. So we've taken a look at those. So are we on the right track? I'd say overall, with respect to ARPA, we're doing better than most. We've got about 45% of our funds already committed or spent. The nationwide average is like 27%. And there are some agencies, including Winnebago County, for example, that hasn't spent a dime or barely spent a dime. Everybody's different. So we're just, but they're going through a different process than we did. Council gave us some real clear direction early on. When you give us clear direction, it's pretty easy. You say, we'd like to do this, and we go, okay, we're going to do that. But are we on the right track? Because it was infrastructure. It didn't say street infrastructure or IT infrastructure. It was infrastructure. And I think we took a look at it, and you could easily look at these and say, I agree or I disagree. And I probably agree with you either way. So are we on the right track with this stuff is really kind of the gist we're looking for. And we talked about inviting the Long Range Finance Committee because you've weighed in on the facility strategy. You've been weighing in for years on the debt strategy, and I look to our senior member of the committee. But we've been talking about that for a long time, and that was one of the first policy issues that the committee ever looked at, and we have not let that go. And I think that's helped us and the council with, we know where you want to go on this, and our goal is to land near 40%. And Councilmember Ford, who can't be here tonight, sent us an email and says, I think I understand where you're going. I just want to make sure we're continuing to make progress. That's his 2 cents on the thing. But collectively, are we going in the right direction?
I just have one question about the levy, if we could talk about that once again, because you talked about how right now we're at 1.1, we're jumping to 1.3, but then in 2025 it jumps all the way up to almost 2.5, and I'm just wondering how is that going to work?
Yeah, well, it's not. Like I said, and then maybe I glanced over it, but there's a lot of work that has to be done in the projects identified in 25 and 26, 27. Quite honestly, some of those projects aren't going to happen because we aren't going to be able to afford to do them. That'll be a decision point, not tonight as this part of this plan, but as we look at financing projects starting in 2024, and it's more particularly 25 and 26 and 27. So the requests are there. I think it's important that you understand the requests are there. And I think the requests are valid. We sat down with every single department. We talked about their needs, their thoughts, what they think they need to do to fulfill our strategic plan. This is their request. The hard part now is, it's just like a family budget. What can you afford?
But if the levy doesn't reach that amount, that has nothing to do with the percentage of, that we're looking at, the 40 to 50%?
No, that's a separate bucket, and that is bucket that's coming directly out of tax levy. So if you go back to...
No, that's okay.
No, that's a good question. If we go back to here, these are all the buckets. And we spend almost our time on general obligation debt, levy, ARPA, and then I talked about the to be determined. We didn't talk about all these other buckets that are out there, but it's just that's how we fund those things. So if it's in the levy, we actually, when we do our tax levy in November, December, that'll be part of, along with our operational levy dollars that are spread out in the current plan. If a project's going to be financed over multiple years, then we're looking at debt.
The big challenge.
Basically cash.
Yeah, it's the challenge with the levy is we just went from $1.1 million to a proposed $1,283,000. That's a $183,000 increase in our levy. You do the math, that's probably about a 4.5 cent increase in the tax rate just for that increase.
Let me just share this point of view. Last year at this time, we were looking at potential levy projects of 1.5, and Mark says, "You're crazy." I said, "Oh no, I think we can do it." Well, that 1.5 became 1.1 when it came time to.
So it's only half crazy this year.
A question on going back to the department by funding source. So on 0740 for planning, so it's showing 200,000 for a housing study in 2023, but we just completed the housing study. Is this implementation?
Implementation,
Yes.
yes.
And the request was for 2 million.
Yes.
And so that was like,
1 million.
no, I think it was
Page
2.
11,
It was-
under that tab.
Yeah, so we had to do something that was within our capabilities.
And then the other question is under the ARPA
You think it was
project.
only $1 million, huh?
So on the section for 2023 and 2024, Okay, so these are outside of the 75% that we, or this is inclusive of the 75% we designated.
It's inclusive, that's inside the
Okay.
75%.
Okay, so just curious how you decided or scored the projects to fall into 2023 and 2024 through ARPA dollars.
Well, the first thing I did was looked at the projects that City Council appropriated ARPA dollars in 2022. Some of those similar projects I carried forward. For example, replacement of fire hose and some of the other things. Quite honestly, I made my own determination of what I thought might be appropriate uses of ARPA funding that would benefit the community in certain areas and that we really couldn't afford to include on the levy dollars or in our borrowing. It's my recommendation, along with the city manager, I hope, that you would consider these. That you may not agree with all of them, but certainly we could have that discussion.
You could have just as easily switched these out with any item for borrowing or levy.
There are needs that have been identified. For example, we talked about the replacement of West Haven signals. They were put up on a temporary basis. We really want to get to a permanent facility structure there. We were trying to keep that framework of new debt to about $7 million. The levy is already at 1.2. We thought it was important to move forward, and I suggested that we include that with our list of ARPA projects. Now, you may or may not disagree with that, and that's fine. I could, understand your point of view, but that's pretty much how I came up with that recommendation.
And then the, can you go back to the slide in the beginning where we added in this year the serving underserved populations? We had it highlighted in red.
Well, there's one there, and then we did it, oops. Where was it? It was,
I think it was towards the beginning.
Yeah, you'll see it when it gets right there.
So, I guess, Mark, question is, can you give some examples of where the criteria points were given for that particular criteria?
What I can tell you is when I look through all of these, because I don't have a minimum or maximum point system, the projects that score best, I can tell you have historically been utility projects that are under mandate because they cover so many different areas. I think this helps with projects for parks in particular, but also economic development, neighborhood improvement. Those are the ones where I think that would receive more points with that. The survey, I can tell you from scoring these over the years, that one of the reasons that we added it to this area was before this was done, it was actually just percentage of population served. And
So that's like service level down below.
no, it was, service level doesn't improve the level of service we're providing. So that's more of a subjective thing. With the percentage of population served, it was what percentage of our population is actually served. A sewer project would get that near 100% versus, say, an improvement at a neighborhood park, or even arguably the public museum, which is technically open to the public, but what's our general attendance? Pretty low compared to the entire population. So it's less than 10%. That doesn't make it any less important. The senior center is a really good example. I mean, we've got certain population, it's between 10 and 20%. So adding this element adds another layer. And I'm still going through a few of them that I still need to do, particularly the new ones.
So
It's added at most 15 points to any one project. But if the project's only scoring at 70, 80%, it might get near 100 with that. But that's about it. But when all is said and done, that's still weighing on my mind, even though it's only worth 15 points, because it's like that project has to get done, because it goes back to the other criteria that we use, that section that you talked about, how we prioritize.
Yeah.
It's more than just the points it gets.
So you.
Most of public facilities gets lousy points because what does City Hall serve in terms of the public? Relatively low or everybody? You tell me.
Well, that's why I was asking about the ARPA stuff, because it did kind of seem like we had a lot of museum pieces in there. And so that's why I was asking the previous question, and then in relation to this, if you were using the same criteria from here to the ARPA.
I would say go to that other slide
Yeah, before you do that,
Oh,
you
okay,
might
good.
want to, just for your reference, we did give you a blank scoring sheet. It's like the
Yep.
fourth tab in. And in there, you can see the different point values and the rationale for the points. So you might want to take that. But you wanted me to go to which side, Mark?
The other slide no, I guess you got to go up.
Oops. Oh, you
I went
did.
the wrong way. Sorry. Yeah, the factors. So this starts it, and then you get to the next page, and you start getting into the other issues. So, for example, go to the next page, Russ, please. When you get into meeting other goals of the city strategic plan, that's evolved. And I think when you take a look at our most recent strategic plan, we added inclusivity and equity's always been there, but, how are we doing with that? Those are things that I definitely take a look at. Did we look at this when we put together the ARPA list, which I think is really the genesis of your question? I would say yes, but it's all of these things. It's not just the scoring sheet, because I think there are more elements to it. There's sometimes we do it just because to avoid increased maintenance costs. Other times, it's the right thing to do. And sometimes that's a read on where the rest of council is.
So what happens if, July 12th, when we go to do the strategic plan update, not that I think this has ever happened in the past, but let's say there was a shift, a significant shift in the strategic plan that's, more than likely it's going to be incremental, if any changes. But if there were to be, it just seems like we're a little bit out of sequence.
Yes. In the real world, we would have wanted to have completed our strategic planning process before we started this. And I think the last cycle we did strategic planning was done, earlier in the year, with changes and everything else that's gone on. We have to live with what we have. Is it ideal? Probably not, but this is the hand we're working with right now.
But I would say by the time you adopt the strategic plan, we're going to know those things, and that'll come out, because one of you will have every right to say, we just decided to prioritize X in our strategic plan, and we may need to go back and say, based on that, where do we reprioritize things? And we still have a chance to do it. The schedule is for you to approve the plan, per se, in August. You don't approve the budget until November. So there's still multiple opportunities to evaluate those very things.
And I would add too, I think, when Finance Director Van Gompel came here, he kind of tried to change the nature of how we use a CIP. And his philosophy, and he'll correct me, I'm sure if I'm wrong, is that the CIP itself is a planning document too. So it's a planning document. The strategic plan is a planning process. And as Mark said, we still have a little bit of time. But the sequencing, is it perfect? No.
Russ, did you have more?
No.
Oh, okay. Going back to the funding source and that levy thing, is it accurate to say in a 10-year CIP, regularly years 3, 4, 5 would be a bump above, just because that's when things get pushed to?
That has happened. I mean, quite honestly, when we start looking at the limited resources, There were some requests that came in for 2023. They got moved to 24, which moved some of 24 to 25. And that's a part of this process. Like I said, it's pretty common that we try to look at the next 2 years, 2023 and 24, as, being close to realistic as possible. But we all know that things change. Things will be changing, whether it's by strategic planning or whatever, yet in 23, and it'll be changing again in 24. Our priorities may change. Projects will be moved, shifted. Some projects that are in 26 may get requested to be moved forward quicker, and we will have to adjust that plan. That's why this plan is looked at every year.
Sometimes bridges just stop working, you gotta-
Yeah.
Shit.
Right.
Thank you.
Things like that happen, yeah.
Well, I just want to say that I really appreciate, since you've been here, Russ, the ability to have this tool interactive, like right now, real time. And I'm a little bit nervous about the assumption on the equalized value. However, the safety valve there is, as you said, if it comes in lower than that, we don't borrow as much the next year. So I'm supportive of us going in that direction and in that general framework.
I think that if you were to talk to the city manager, this 8% increase in equalized value in 2021,
Was it an anomaly?
no, he would have never guessed that would have happened. I'm thinking that our 2022 number is still going to be a healthy. Right now, again, I'm speaking of current economic conditions. I'm expecting more than 2.6% increase in our
Right.
equalized value.
So we're already being kind of conservative with that.
Yes, that's my
You still have
Thought
this
to-
at -1?
probably.
Take
Yeah,
it
it
off.
still is.
Oh, yeah.
I
Happy number, the real time happy number up there.
Sorry. Okay, thank you.
But you
I
could
was
also.
I was looking at here's the actual.
There's your negative numbers you were asking
Yeah, we
about.
had negative 1.28, negative 0.14.
Right.
But if you look at
Boom.
these last 5 years, we've been having some good growth in our equalized value. And from what I've read and seen in current market conditions, they're still holding strong. Will they be holding strong 5 years from now? If I had that crystal ball, I don't think I'd be here right now.
You hit the track. Yeah.
But thank you. I'm not saving that. I'll just go back to the version I had. But
Yeah, he never saves. Never.
not on that one we're up here.
But to
And
that
having
point,
these broken out by the multiple flows is really helpful.
Good. I'm glad you like that. For this thing, though, the big key point that I hopefully we're all in agreement. I haven't heard anybody say no to $7.5 million in new money in 2023, and the plan or the framework of $18 million. And if we're way off of base, if now you want to tell us, that there's no way we can afford to do that,
How would you know?
how would I know? What's your comfort level?
That's
That's why we're talking right now.
Well-
So if you don't have that comfort level, you need to tell us.
Russ, after the last committee meeting, it took me a while to get to the 15 that we talked about on a comfort level. But then I realized that while getting to the goal of 50% and keeping it there required the pushing back of the $65 million in deferred maintenance. So in order to catch up, in order to achieve equilibrium between the deferred maintenance and the borrowing and the 50%, it's going to take a balancing act. But you're telling us today that you think you can balance it at 18 million, 18.5, whatever the number was.
Yeah, and we had some discussion. Do you want to knock this down after that 10-year window? I don't know. I did start knocking it down in these later years, but I left it at 18 right now. And if you want me to tell me that, our framework is only good for 10 years and maybe we should be looking at, 15 or 16 million after that, I'm fine with that. But I think from what I heard through the strategic planning process and what I heard from our facility folks is we got to have a plan to address our deferred maintenance on facilities. And we can't do that in 1 year. We can't do it in 5 years. I think we can do it in a fiscal responsible manner in 10 years.
We have no choice except to make a plan like this, because that is one thing being on the school board taught me. The mess you get into if you keep deferring maintenance.
Yeah. You can't operate when you put your head in the sand.
No. You cannot keep deferring maintenance.
But the thing that just kind of sticks in my head is, as we are growing and achieving that equalize, the EV, that we're also growing as a city, which is adding more road, and yet we may not necessarily be servicing or repairing any more per year as we are yet growing, which throws us backwards on street maintenance, which puts us back into deferred maintenance on streets.
I kind of skipped over that, and I talked about it at one point. There is a tab.
You got a tab for everything, don't you?
It's called
It just says
utility infrastructure. It's probably about
Yep.
60% into your book. It would be in front of engineering, behind fire is utility infrastructure. And I think it's important just to kind of focus your discussion, Mayor. There's actually 3 pages of summary. The first 3 pages. And, we have planned for $30 million a year, and that's probably the best part is going back to that with funding source. Because the funding source isn't all with debt. Go back to this and see if I can find that. If you go back to, I'm sorry to make you flip again, but if you want to go back to that funding source, projects and funding source by department. And what's the account number for utility infrastructure? 410. It's probably page 6 is actually the total. So it's page 6 under that tab.
Which tab again?
I'm sorry, it is projects and funding source by department. Page 6. And the number on that, and this is a total, the projects are listed above it, but this is a summary of the funding sources for this grouping. If you go to line 4401 debt again, you'll see that in 2023 we have $5.8 million in debt. In 24, 5.6, 25, 6.4, 26, 7.1, 27, 5.3, 4.7, 5.9, 6. So we're under that $7 million framework in every year. Even the highest year is 7.1. So that gives us a little leeway for some of those other types of debt projects. But James submitted this schedule, again, based on what he thinks they can design, bid, and manage from a construction standpoint. And he thinks this is very realistic, and this is kind of maxing out the capacity of staff. And I think even calling on outside engineering as needed. But this is the level that he thinks makes sense to our community. I hate to speak for James, but I think the city manager will concur. When we had our discussions with him.
And I would add too, when city manager Roloff came here after the floods that occurred in 2007 and 8, we made adjustments based on the need for the community. So I remember being in a meeting with him, and he said, I think we need to double our activities. And we need to get this done for the community because it needs it. as soon as possible. So I think your point is well made, Mayor, but I think that same opportunity is going to be available to this city manager or another city manager in the future when that problem presents itself. And then, that plan will have to be tweaked to address it. I mean, hopefully it won't be as serious a problem as we had when the floods took place. And I think we're on a good path to mitigate that going forward, but it was done before, and I think it can be done again.
So I know James isn't here, but city manager, do you know, like, how many miles of new road and sidewalk have we added since, I don't know, in the last 5 years?
We have not added all that much. There's some relatively small subdivisions that have been done in the scheme of things, but I would say,
Miles?
at most, yeah, there's really not that much. A couple miles at most. Now, we're only doing a few miles of road with this, and we'll be needing to take a look at that as time goes on. But we're within our means, within our abilities. We're doing it. We're still doing. It almost sounds like an exaggeration, but you take a look at that very page that Russ has highlighted. We got 10 years of projects worth $260 million. That's almost half of. If you take a look at the bottom line, it's $556 million. In the scheme of things, Oshkosh is still a relatively small community compared to other large cities. We've got a $500 million CIP for 10 years. We may be a small city, but this is no small operation. And we have to annually look at this stuff like this to challenge ourselves, because I think, some of the discussion was, I thought 15 million was enough, and then I looked at our needs and said, maybe 18 isn't so bad. These are the things, this is a crossroads for you, because to do the facilities, and I'm looking at Mr. Fitzpatrick because, he's been the bird chirping in my ear about this since council gave the goal. It's like, facilities, don't forget facilities, because why? Well, number one, his department has to maintain them, and he knows the condition of them. But if we're going to make some progress, we're going to have to make a commitment. So I think we annually, that's why you do this annually. It's not like, we got a 10-year plan, let's take the next 10 years off. We take a 10-year plan, and we do a 10-year plan every single year. And it's interesting that we're talking 10 years, because it's only been the last couple of years that we've gone to that. And we're still working on that. The departments, Crystal's plowed through a lot of these projects. Not everybody's totally at 10 years. Wouldn't you say that's fair, Crystal? Yeah, so not everybody's there yet. Public Works is, because that's kind of in their DNA.
And it's part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. So I think that's a lens that we need to look at in order to make sure that we're, maximizing the opportunity that we have through that new law. And the stretching of the facilities. So those are two, lenses that helped us, expand it a little bit.
Okay, so that was back on.
So what I just handed out, Mayor and members, I gave you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, so you can take that with you. You didn't have that before. So
I guess just going back to the funding source real quick here. I thought at one point we had talked about potentially using some CDBG dollars to do some street work in distressed census tracts. But I know that that's floating around here. I think I saw an announcement that the CDBG action plan was this week.
Yeah, it'll be on the council agenda next
Right.
week.
So, is that not being recommended? I haven't.
I don't think we had anything in this plan for that.
Not
We
yet.
weren't sure what the approval process was. If you're looking at the funding summary again, there's some grant money. Some of that is the infrastructure bill money, and some of it's other grant programs coming in. I don't recall anything coming from the CDBG, but we can check on that.
I think you could see down the road with implementing the housing study, because of how much, Russ and I were going back and forth, was it 2 million, was it 1 million? It was a lot more than what we're allocating at 200,000. So the answer to that question might be might lie in what you just suggested. Where's CDBG in this? We may need some CDBG funds down the road to implement some of the housing study recommendations. And that's not out of the realm of the possibility. I can tell you that the discussions I've been having with the different nonprofits about use of ARPA, I've included Ms. Nyforth in the discussions because she's looking for opportunities to utilize CDBG as a potential backfill if we can't fund it with ARPA. They need more than that, or it's clearly an issue it's clearly a CDBG, Community Development Block Grant, is limited to low and moderate income beneficiaries. So the projects that we've seen.
Authorized use.
Oh, yeah, no
Street,
question
yeah.
about it. But we want to be careful with CDBG because all the strings that are tied to the federal money, we want to be careful about. So, for example, we use some of that money to fund the land purchase for day by day. Land is easy, and that could be in a capital improvement plan. But if we used to build the building, we'd probably pay the $150,000 wouldn't cover the extra cost for all the bidding requirements, and sometimes it's just not worth it. So we got to be careful with those. But acquiring blighted buildings, doing things like grants to homeowners, those are things. So we're looking for the right opportunity to use CDBG.
I have one other question about the 4401 line on the funding source summary. How does that relate to the $18 million? The total debt number, I expected it to match, but clearly it doesn't. So I'm just wondering how that.
You're at the funding summary page?
That's the model. This is the reality. But we got to go back to your question earlier about 25 and 26 seem to be inching up. We got to balance it out.
Okay.
And the beauty of this model, Russ, if you want to scroll just up just a skosh.
That's a funding source summary?
Yeah.
Yeah, the funding source, because it's 14,271, which is a solid number we can rely on. 18,271, Russ showed in his presentation, but for purposes of this model, we only went to 18. He just did an average of 18. There's no way we're borrowing $31.4 million in 2025. Now, the only way we could, either we cut it or we say we're going to borrow more now, but less the next year, because the average has got to be 18 if we're following this model. The beauty of this model as presented is it balances great for 23. And 24, we'll be back in these same chairs next year having a similar, not identical, but a similar conversation. But you'll be 1 year wiser. And that 1 year is going to make a world of difference for the 2024 budget year.
Basically, projects in that $31 million, won't happen in 25. It'll get pushed back to 26, which makes 20. And then, this is Adam's question before. And 26 becomes bigger, and you'll have to push more back there. So it's a planning initiative, knowing what we can afford, knowing what the requests are, and unfortunately, no matter how hard we try, just like in our family budget, we're not going to be able to afford everything that people want. And it's just finding that equilibrium.
Unless the people want to pay more taxes, which of course they don't.
Or unless folks start looking at some sacrifices of what we're providing.
They don't
If
want
we
that
need
either.
to continue to provide certain
Service.
facilities or certain services.
I would just add to the comments, I think for maybe the first time in a long time, you're seeing the complete picture of what all the needs are. In the past, a lot of the facility issues were not, it was kind of a hole in our vision. They weren't visible.
Right.
Now they're visible and you see the whole thing as ugly as it might be. At least we see it.
The duct tape can only hold so long.
That's a good way. That's a good way to say it.
And the bubble gum's getting dry.
I remember that on another topic we got to talk about. Any other questions on the plan itself?
I'd really like to thank the long-range finance folks for making time there to participate. We haven't had a joint long-range finance. Thank you, Deputy Mayor, for suggesting that.
Well, I'd like to thank you for inviting us because I think this meeting has been really helpful. I mean, we have council members on the committee, but it's not quite the same. This really helped a lot.
No, and that was the purpose, as I told Long Range Finance. On all of our boards and commissions, our job is to liaise, right? It's to go back and forth with information, not necessarily dictate the path. And so this one was really about making sure that members of the committee heard right from council, or saw the willingness to take on certain debt loads or to address certain things, so that we can go back and hopefully craft a decent recommendation for council to consider in terms of a long-term plan, a bigger future goal.
So is it your vision then that long-range finance is actually going to make a specific recommendation on CIP?
I think that's between Russ and I and the committee. I think that's the plan. Unfortunately, that discussion won't have much of an impact on the 23 plan. It can't. Timing-wise, it's just incapable of achieving that. But in terms of it's the bigger picture, and also acknowledging that we've got a big debt, possible debt load in terms of facility needs, and having a citizen group weigh in on, is this appropriate? Is this plan right? Is 10 years the right number? Year length, all those things, and giving us some guidance from a committee.
The only other question I would have for Russ is, because we like this toy, this Excel spreadsheet, that you can do what-if scenarios, is there a version of that that allows for us to have our own copy and to remove, add, as council members are looking at those final decisions?
To date, I've only been willing to do it in kind of a public setting, and the reason is the spreadsheet that you see on the screen when I show it, columns A, B, column Q. Okay, there's other columns in this.
Sure.
And some of this it's when you start adding debt here, when does it come off? And that's when I work with Ellers on the debt taken on. And when we add 18 million here, we got to account for that coming off in here. And so it looks simple when I do it on a screen. I drew,
Just to clarify, there are no secret columns, just so we're all on the same page.
Well, I guess, okay, let's just say like this. What if we were looking at the projects and funding sources by department? No. We want to look at projects by department. If council wanted to use just a section of that to kind of, I guess, play, for lack of a better word.
We've put the CIP on the website. We can certainly put this draft CIP up on the website for public to view, have their way in. I don't have a problem with that. I guess, I thought your specific question was regarding the spreadsheet. I was just kind of thinking it was a little bit, and some of it has the rate impact and some other charts that I use. As long as you kind of don't really crucify the spreadsheet, I don't have a problem with it. But
We'll have to send you a new spreadsheet every time. If you save it, you're going to get yourself in trouble because all the assumptions could get messed up.
yeah, so I'd rather, I could.
Because with this, there's only two variables. It's percentage of growth and debt taken on. The rest all auto calculates. So there's only two things. If you take this, those are the only two things you should be messing with, because those are the only two actual
Yeah, it's
variables.
this number and
Anything
this
in-
number.
Yeah. The percentage changes that
That
column.
changes automatic up
That
here.
changes off of that. The rest is just new debt. So there's a lot of logic built into all those percentage columns over there.
But I'd certainly be willing to run any
So how
scenario.
would you like to see council members individually submit their kind of scenarios of changes to the state? In the past, what we've done is just given you line items,
Right.
but we don't necessarily
what
We're
my
only dealing with line items, we're not seeing that.
my vision is, if you're comfortable with the plan, to get the plan adopted. And if there's specific projects that you want to either include or exclude, that we would discuss that with the department heads during the operating budget discussions.
Yeah.
And we can certainly, that's the mechanism that actually funds the project. This is just a plan. This is a plan with funding out of some major buckets. If you want to say yes or no to, and pick a project, badger books in the clerk's office, and say no, that has to come up through the appropriations process, through the operating budget before we adopt the operating budget. This is not going to appropriate any money for any specific project, other than to tell you these are the projects we're thinking to include in the operating budget.
And that should be a discussion with the entire group.
That'll be basically a city council
Yeah.
discussion when we discuss the budget.
You don't need us for that.
We wanted long-range finance to talk about the framework and whether that framework made sense.
And really tonight, it's debt tolerance. Because that's what this is all about. If we don't want as much, then they've got to find a way to cut. If we want more, then they're going to make some suggestions on how to fill.
So that's the framework. And as I had started out tonight, right down here, the policy issues. What are we going to fund out of ARPA, and what is our framework for future debt issuance? That's what I was hoping to get out of tonight.
One more question, please.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Does the 18 affect our Moody's rating?
The 18 does not. The ratio of our debt to the state debt limit plays into our rating.
Okay.
The lower that percentage, the better off Moody's says we're going to be. But they also look at a bunch of other economic factors, some that we have no control over, like the per capita, valuation per capita. But they also look at the debt from the school district and the county. They look at factors of state funding and how well the state funding is. But they look at our operations. We've had a couple of good years where we've added to our fund balance. That's helping. And there's a whole framework of issues that they look at to make that rating.
You just triggered something that was in Councilmember Ford's email, but also, the discussion about the operating budget, our fund balance. The committee has established a fund balance policy, and we're over our maximum allowed. So one of the other issues that will be coming forward is what to do with the surplus. Our maximum surplus is set at 30.
We look at a percentage of next year's budget, and I give that to City Council every year. The fund balance policy that was recommended by Long Range Finance and approved by City Council established a parameter of at least 16% of next year's budget to 30% of next year's budget. And we are over that. I think we are approaching 40 or low 40%. Does that sound right, Jennifer, back there? So our current fund balance is over the maximum amount that we have by policy. There was some discussion, and that's not recommended for any funding source right now for projects. There are some things that are on the horizon that we think we should probably keep that as part of the discussion before we decide what to do with the excess fund balance. But that'll be part of the budget discussion as well.
And one of the things I would submit to you, and Councilmember Ford has some other ideas that I have not chatted with him about at all, but I think aside from what he was suggesting, if you take a look at the ARPA list, and those are filling needs, as ARPA goes away, we're going to need a soft landing spot because we can't sustain the ARPA funds. What's going to happen post ARPA? Well, we can use some of the fund balance perhaps to limit our debt increase. I mean, it goes back to your point. We're here tonight to talk about our debt, our tolerance for debt. That fund balance can be used, and I would not recommend anything that would be committing us to any long-term obligations. But using it for capital and debt relief is a good one-time soft landing spot for us.
So, getting back to our discussion on levy dollars, we talked about the fact that we had 1.1 in levy dollars for capital projects. We're projecting in this plan 1.2. If come operating time, we say we're only comfortable with $1 million even, we got $200,000 that we might have an alternative funding source for in reserves, whatever. So we won't have to use all that levy if we really think the levy's going out of line. That'll be a decision point for council to make when they look at the 2023 projects. And you may say, okay, we can't afford the 1.2 levy worth of projects that we've identified. We can pick any number you want and say, well, we're going to reduce the levy.
Okay, so it's 30% was the top, but we're at 40%. What is that dollar amount that we have?
Oh, I didn't prepare that for tonight. I can tell you that the estimate for 2021 increase in fund balance was, what's that dollar amount, Jennifer? About $1.9 million we're adding to fund balance over and above what we had going into the budget cycle. Your budget book has a schedule of the fund balance amount, so just add another 1.2 to that.
We don't know what that.
I do know what it is, but I don't have it at the top of my memory bank.
It's 7 figures. It's easily.
It's, I'm guessing total is 19?
Yes.
So that was $19.1 million in our fund balance right now. What is it above the policy? I had that spreadsheet.
I think it's 12%.
You really wanted to know? Let's see. Hold on a second. See, I have all these great tools if I just learn how to use them, right? Okay, let's see. Nope, that's not what I want.
But yeah, it's several million. Find it.
So is it fair to say it's somewhere in the neighborhood of the amount that we received in ARPA dollars?
No, our excess is,
A couple million.
yeah,
What we're talking about is the
But the total fund balance is 19, the excess is like
Yes.
ish.
yeah. That's a better way to say it.
Okay.
And basically on that one, it's a good idea to be adding to the fund balance, but at a certain point, it's less than fiscally responsible to keep adding to it if we're already, pretty healthy.
So, I don't have 2022 reservations. We're at 19 million dollars. Our policy is, so we're about 4.1 over our policy. That doesn't include any accounting of 2021 actual numbers at this point. I give this spreadsheet to council when we do our budget presentation. I did just work it up through 2020, which is okay. This, I think, is reliable, but it's not published yet. That's pretty much, some of that fund balance is reserve, and these are just carryovers, but there'll be a final accounting for our reservations and our GASB requirements. So this is just an estimated number, the 19, and the policy based on 2022 expenditures, and if that changes, then these numbers change as well.
So part of our next workshop is to finalize that number and then identify any other fund balance issues we might have. For example, it's a new health insurance fund. How are we doing on that? Our workers' comp fund, as you know, we've had some challenging years, the last couple of years. So we have to take a look at those things. So we got to take care of the basic needs, and then we can start saying, okay, now that we know those things, here's how we think we're doing. It was interesting that the chamber, well, when they were taking a look at that report from the Whitburn Center, they were very interested in fund balance, and we were very open about that. And we unlike other agencies, we have a max, and now it's time to do something. And debt reduction is certainly a valid option that's out there, but the landing spot for post ARPA is something we got to look at as well. But we got to make sure the workers' comp fund, for example, is not. We got to bail that out if it needs bailing out. That's an ongoing issue. We're always looking at that.
So council's next workshop is scheduled for August 30th. We look at some early projections for 2023. We look at some where we're at in 2022 and go from there. But that's the next step in the budgeting process.
Okay.
You have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation? That's all that I have to present.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and we are right on time. Imagine.